Nigel Farage is a real risk to Labour, but we have some exclusive polling that shows how Labour could beat him. Labour won a landslide at last year's general election. But if there was an election tomorrow, data suggests Reform UK would win the most seats. We've heard a great deal about Reform's popularity and appeal since the election, but not a huge amount about its weaknesses. So today we're revealing some exclusive polling on what kind of messaging Labour and other political parties could use to counter the rise of Reform and the leadership of Nigel Farage. So Steve, firstly tell us who you are and what you work on so that our listeners know a bit about you.
Yeah, so I'm a polling analyst of sorts. I do lots of work looking at public attitudes in the context of communications, campaigns, and that kind of thing. And last year I started a small research initiative, Persuasion UK. So we're non-profit, non-partisan. We do two things. So we do deep dives into kind of thorny topics to find out what influences public opinion on different policy debates. And then crucially, I guess we look at the way that the electorate is changing and party brands are changing and party brands are perceived. And I guess that's part of what this work relates to.
Okay, and you're known for that blue wall concept, Rachel. I think you had a question about that.
Yeah, what is the blue wall? What did it mean when you coined it, and what does it mean now?
So I think when the original definition, and I try not to be too precious about this, but the original definition was areas, I guess, where the Conservatives were consistently underperforming against the national trend. So in the 2017 election, in the 2019 election, where they actually won those elections, where actually were they quietly going backwards, and where was either the Labour Party or the Lib Dems quietly advancing despite doing poorly nationally, and those were the kind of areas that I coined originally the kind of blue wall, and where I felt like the Conservatives were weak. And obviously that did turn out to be true in the 2024 election, although they were also weak in many other areas. I think it's probably lost its slight definition now, and it's kind of just become anywhere that's vaguely leafy and a bit Lib Dem. Yes. But it had an original definition, and it was mostly those kind of areas on the edges of cities that kind of graduates were moving out to. Yeah. I was thinking, I grew up in Hove, and next door is East Worthing and Shoreham, and it's those kind of areas that Labour and that have been traditionally Conservative that were just slowly going Lib Dem and Labour, and that was my original definition. But I try not to be too precious over the way that it's evolved.
Well, I think didn't Ed Davey do a stunt where he was driving a bulldozer through a wall of blue bricks?
Yeah. So I feel partly responsible for some of the many photo ops that have been developed.
You started the Ed Davey stunt craze.
Exactly. Yeah, I won't charge royalties on those.
You should ask for one of those blue bricks to put on your mantelpiece. So this particular research, which you're sharing with us exclusively, so thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. You've taken me through it before recording. It's kind of the thing that's been lost a bit in the political discourse, isn't it? What are Reform UK's weaknesses in terms of public opinion? So tell us why you decided to pursue this particular angle.
Yeah, obviously Reform are fairly new kind of party on the scene in British politics, right? So there's not a lot of research on how they're seen, but insofar as the research exists, obviously as a research community, we've spent quite a lot of time looking at the strengths of Reform. I mean, we ourselves at Persuasion, we released a 10,000 word report on this back in spring, looking at Reform curious Labour voters and all the different ways that Reform can drag Labour voters over into the Reform column. So there's quite a lot of research on the strengths and the appeal of Reform, naturally, given they're riding high at the moment. But yeah, there's less research, I would say, on kind of what messages Reform or the Farage brand might be vulnerable to. Yeah. And we understand that for Labour. We kind of have a good sense of the Labour brand and the strengths and weaknesses there, and less so with Reform. So I guess we're just kind of plugging that research gap, and we're trying to do so in a fairly objective way.
Yeah, and you used quite an unusual method for this. Can you explain in as layman terms as possible to our listeners how you did it?
So I guess your listeners may be familiar with the concept in a medical context of a randomised control trial. So we use randomised control trial message testing. Yeah, it works similar to a medical trial. We recruited 6,000 people into a survey, 6,000 people into a polling survey, and then we split them into 6 groups. And each of those groups looks demographically identical. Same number of men, women, Labour voters, Reform voters. And then, so 5 of those groups see just one message that looks to counter Reform and looks to counter Farage. And then there's one group that that is a control group that sees no message at all. And at the end, all of the experiment, all of those groups, no matter what message they've seen, or if they've seen no message, they take the same survey, in this case on their attitudes to Reform. And the crucial thing that we then look at in the analysis phase is, okay, where are people's opinions different in the different treatment groups compared to people that saw no message at all? well. And provided that it goes above a certain level, like into something that's like statistically significant, we can say that this is, if they have a different attitude to the control group, it's because of the message that they've seen.
Right.
And the reason I like this is it goes a bit beyond just saying, well, do you like this message or do you agree with it? And it gets into what's the actual effect of a message on people's underlying attitudes, which in this case is their attitude towards reform. So it's a bit complex to explain, but actually it's fairly intuitive when you look at the way it's done. And it just gives us a much better picture of what messages are persuasive, not just what messages people agree with.
Now, obviously, which messages did you decide to show those groups and why?
Yeah, so I just wanted to test a couple of different theories, I guess, and it will not be exhaustive, and maybe we can get into some of the ways in which there are limitations to the research. But the first one I wanted to test, I suppose, is a deliverist theory. So we showed people a Sky News package of the deportations of asylum seekers or failed asylum seekers that the government put out, and the way that was reported. So I suppose to try and mimic the idea that the government is responding to concerns that are raised by people who are reform curious. Mm-hmm. So that was the first one, the deportation video. We tested a video of Sophie Ridge interrogating Richard Tice over his positions on climate change and climate change denial. We tested a video the Labour Party put out about attacking Farage on the NHS. And then we tested a couple of slightly new theories, which was tying Farage to Trump. Mm-hmm. And then tying Farage to, I guess, what you might call corporate interests in terms of his connections with big business and stuff like that. So we had 5 distinct territories. And then, we look at the persuasion effects of all of these different ones in the analysis. What
did you find that people responded to and people didn't respond to in those messages that you've just taken us through?
Yeah, there was basically 2 of them that really jumped out. And the other ones did okay, but not great. Mm-hmm. So we're just looking at, where is the reform brand vulnerable? And two territories really kind of popped, I suppose. The first of which, and we do see this in the wider research, which is a message that was kind of tying Farage to Trump and reminding people of his proximity to Trump, both ideologically and personally. Mm-hmm. And it was a similar kind of message to the one that Mark Carney used against Polyev in Canada, right? Just like Trump this, just like Trump that. And that did move the dial on people's favourables towards Farage quite a lot downwards and towards reform downwards. So that suggests that there's a brand vulnerability there for reform, which we do see in the wider research. I mean, people do say that in focus groups and it comes up a lot in standard polling.
Okay. Wasn't there that poll just after the Zelensky Trump Oval Office meeting that showed a really quite sharp decline in Nigel Farage's personal favourability and an uptick in Keir Starmer's around that time? And I remember it because I think that was true even among reform supporters, right, that they found, I mean, it didn't go negative, but they found that a kind of, moment.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the few times that I think reform or Farage's favourables have dipped in this parliament, and one of the few times that Starmer's have gone up. So yeah, that's definitely true. And that shows you the vulnerability that when that is salient, it causes problem. When that issue of Trump is salient to voters it does cause some vulnerability for Farage. So that was the first one that came up. The second one, though, that really did the best was actually this territory of tying reform to corporate interests. And what I mean by that is it basically told people that they take millions of pounds in donation from fossil fuel lobbyists, that they have connections to the powerful, the rich and powerful. And this was across the board very effective at pushing down people's willingness to vote reform, their favourability towards Farage, the favourability towards the party, the sense that reform stands up for people like them. So this does suggest that there's a brand vulnerability there that probably hasn't been spoken to yet, or that has come up less in research. And we can speculate on why that works well. I think partly that it speaks to people's cynicism, partly that it provides some new information. I think a lot of people are not aware of some of the stuff that was in the message where they're fairly familiar with other things about reform. But crucially, I think it provides a kind of explanatory framework for why are they against workers' rights, let's say, why are they in favour, why was he in favour of the trust budget and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that those are right necessarily, but it provides a kind of explanation for that stuff. So that would be my guess as to why it did well, but it worked extremely consistently to push down the reform.
I suppose it also points to the vulnerability of their brand, because they're supposed to be anti-elites, aren't they? But they have these interests that you've mentioned in the messaging there. And I think you've seen that happen sometimes, at rallies where Nigel Farage has lamented or tried to lament the fact that, or not the fact that, but this idea that millionaires are sort of leaving the UK. And then you hear people in the audience shouting, good riddance. And then he has to say, oh, no, it's a bad thing. We don't want that to happen.
He sort of tries to pivot. But yeah.
And it's tricky for him, I think, that and pointing out that hypocrisy is probably one of the things that makes people realise that, he necessarily isn't the person that he says he is, or the party isn't representing all the values that they assume that they are.
One thing that I found really interesting, though, and the messages that didn't work as successfully, is the delivery on irregular immigration and small boats. And the reason I just think that that's something that Labour should really kind of take on board is, I think you wrote in the research that we've managed to see exclusively, that when you draw attention to the issue of illegal immigration, even if you're drawing attention to what the Labour government is doing about it, it just makes people more likely to see it as a really key policy priority, and therefore look to a party that has it front and centre at the heart of it, which is Farage. And I think that's interesting because we saw that with Rishi Sunak's government in the last year, which is the more he tried to talk about Rwanda and small boats, the more public perception of the Conservatives' credibility on that issue actually went down. And it's a trap that Labour totally should have seen coming and seems to have walked straight into, that they're focusing on a policy area that just raises public awareness of the fact that there's another party that has got a harder line on it.
Yeah, because that group who watched the deportation video, I think you found that there was actually a little uptick in their support for reform compared to the control group, didn't you? Yeah,
it was very small and probably not massively statistically significant. But yeah, we did see it. I mean, the main significant effect was that it made people pick immigration more as a top 3 issue. And I think it does speak to that risk. And it's a challenge for the government because it's clearly an issue that people care a lot about and that you can't completely ignore, particularly there's some parts of its voting coalition. But I think it highlights exactly the risk raised that Rachel raised there, which is the kind of Sunak position is the worst position to be in, where you're making interventions on this, you're making PR interventions on this. So you're raising the importance of the topic in the news and you're keeping it in the news, but you're not, in people's perception anyway, you've not fixed the underlying issue. And so all it kind of does is remind people of the issue. And that's a real challenge, I think, for social democratic governments generally, which is how do you respond to these issues and fix the underlying issues and get them out of the news agenda, but in a way that people are aware that you're doing it without sort of just inflating the salience of the topic, which in the end is one that is very much kind of core reform territory.
Yeah, and what were the others? Climate denial was one of them that you didn't find had a particular impact on voters' opinion.
Yeah, climate, the kind of the showing Tice's climate denial it didn't move that much. And I think my theory on that is partly that people who are kind of open to voting reform are probably, they're not anti-net zero necessarily, but they don't care that much. Right. So I think it probably just didn't move anybody new. If you're kind of appalled by his positions on climate denialism, then you're probably already not that susceptible to voting reform.
You don't need to see that video.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So it doesn't really sort of convert anyone new. Whereas the nice thing about this methodology is looking at who can it convert.
And the NHS one, that's interesting because that's something that Labour have gone really quite hard on. It's mentioned in PMQs basically every time a reform MP asks a question, there's an answer about, look at what they want to do to our NHS. And your research suggests that that's not really landing.
Yeah, but I also don't quite know why, because the logic of it is kind of impeccable to a degree. Because
I have a theory on why it might not be landing.
Yeah.
Which is that they're old comments.
Yes.
And Nigel
Farage's comments about an insurance system rather than...
Yeah, and he stopped saying that in the last couple of years. And I wonder if there's a kind of sense of, he did stuff in the past, but we're in a crisis now, and it kind of doesn't land because it's seen as not so relevant.
Yeah, I think that is a decent kind of theory. I think it may also be that it just sort of somehow seems too extreme or doesn't seem believable that he'd sell off the NHS, or that, again, there's no explanatory framework for why. There's no explain a bit there, so it can maybe just seem a bit over the top. But the logic of it works. The logic of it makes sense. But yeah, I do see fairly consistently in research that it doesn't convert that many new people. Maybe it's a kind of useful thing for energising the Labour base, which is no small thing from a government point of view. But yeah, I don't see very much evidence that it converts new people.
And they certainly find it useful to go on the NHS messaging. I remember speaking to a special advisor who said that it's what swung it in Hamilton, talking about the preserving the sort of sanctity of the NHS from reform, not necessarily switching reform-curious voters back to Labour, but enthusing voters who were probably feeling a little bit disillusioned about the government otherwise.
Right, which really does matter. So, yeah.
I have a question on something that you didn't test for, because another attack line that we've seen from Labour a lot over the past year, again, it's brought up in PNQs constantly, is trying to associate Nigel Farage with Liz Truss. I mean, you mentioned a moment ago that Farage backed the Truss Kwarteng mini budget. It's constantly brought up that Reform are possibly taking advice from Liz Truss when they had Sarah Pochen, their new MP. Starmer made a point of saying that she was a Conservative at the point when Liz Truss was leader. They are going really hard on the idea that Reform's financial plans at this press conference that they held in May, where they were basically saying we can have tax cuts and spending rises and we don't have to worry about how to pay for it, was Trussonomics on steroids, I think was what the Lib Dems called it, and Labour came up with similar messaging. Now, I don't think that's necessarily working as well as they hoped it would. Liz Truss was kind of a very effective messaging strategy for Labour against the Conservatives. But I wonder, is this comparison, is Nigel Farage is the new Liz Truss? I think there was even a graphic that they mocked up where they put the faces together, which was pretty terrifying. Like, is that something that has the potential to that's awful. Is that something that has the potential to be effective, or are they kind of just like refighting the battle from the last election?
I think it has some potential, but and I would say I haven't tested it, so I don't know. So I am guessing. I guess that it depends on whether it's like a values argument or something else. So I think the way that the government have largely prosecuted it so far is a kind of competence thing, and I think that maybe is a little bit less powerful than if you get into the values divides between Farage and the economy and other parties on the economy. So I think it can work, but not kind of as part of a wider kind of values argument, basically. And again, you think you have to provide some explanation and some like wider arguments as to why he has those positions for it to work. But yeah, probably on its own, just as a kind of competence thing, probably not. But I'm guessing. I mean, it's a difficult environment for any message at the moment from the government to cut through because of the brand is quite bad. So maybe over time that will have an effect. But yeah, I suspect that it would have to be a bit more values led for it to cut through.
The brand point is really interesting because I've heard kind of two broad theories for why Truss might not work against reform. One of them is she's just so associated with the Conservatives. People no, they don't like what she did, but they don't really know what it was that she did. And it's it's a Tory toxicity problem, not a kind of wider economic mismanagement problem. And the other one is that, in terms of Liz Truss crashed the economy, Labour's having real issues with the economy, why not roll the dice and take a chance on reform?
To defend, really, do they?
Yeah.
So I suppose it's easier for them to bat away accusations of economic incompetence because they haven't had a chance to test that yet.
You haven't tried us yet.
Yeah. So what are the practical sort of uses of this research, Steve? Have you presented it to Labour and other parties?
I'll be publishing it, for everyone to see. The first thing to say, look, there are some limitations here, and I think any researcher needs to be kind of humble about. There are lots of things, as Rachel just touched on, that we didn't test. There are lots of ways in which we made subjective decisions about what to test and what not to test and how to test it. So that if you want to, you can say, look, this is not the final word on the research, and I'm very interested in if other people have any other theories that they want to bring to the table. But I think it shows I think it broadly aligns with what we've seen in the wider research and the wider literature, this connection with Trump, but also most crucially, I think we saw this in the research we released in the spring as well, the Reform are at strongest when the conflicts in British politics are cultural. Right? Those conflicts and the salience around those conflicts divide the other parties' coalition, particularly Labour's coalition, and it unites the Reform coalition. Whereas the economic conflicts tend to do the opposite. They unite the Labour coalition and coalitions of left parties, and they broadly divide the Reform coalition, which is partly why you see Farage trying to make reassuring noises about those issues. So what it suggests is that basically, for Reform are weak when these kind of economic conflicts are salient, basically. Now, maybe we can get into whether Labour have the space to take advantage of that, and there's lots of reasons maybe they can't, but maybe other parties can. But for sure, I think there's a pretty consistent pattern now that, you need to make the conflict terrain with reform basically economic rather than cultural.
Yeah, and can we just get the wording of the message that did the best, the corporate interests message?
Yeah, so I have it here. So it reads, Nigel Farage says he's on the people's side, but when you take a closer look, it's pretty clear who he's really fighting for. It's the rich, it's the powerful, it's his mates in big business. You read reform has taken £2 million from fossil fuel lobbyists, polluters, climate change deniers. That's not standing up for people. It's selling out to the highest bidder. That's why he wants to cut public services, workers' rights, cut taxes for the rich, handing even more power to elites that he pretends to oppose, just like Trump. He's not smashing the system. He is the system. So that's fairly punchy. Maybe quite difficult for a government to adopt, but definitely it came through very clearly in the research as a brand weakness for reform.
I can see what you're doing there, what you said a moment ago with putting that in the wider context of reform policies and why that might be effective because you've got a narrative. Can I just ask very quickly, I know that this was primarily aimed at how the Labour government can combat reform. Do you think any of these lessons are relevant for the Conservatives or even the Lib Dems? I mean, the Lib Dems have been really pushing the anti-Trump message. Is there anything that they or the Conservatives could do better, I guess?
So I'd say this is research that we'll publish freely. It's not just for Labour or others. We'll open it up to everyone. And I think it's interesting for reform as well to see kind of where the strengths and weaknesses in their brand are. I suppose from the Lib Dems, I think that Trump play is quite an important one. And then maybe for the Greens or others, then maybe that kind of economically populist message is one that they feel that they can adopt more comfortably than Labour.
It's easier for the Greens, isn't it? Because Labour did make a lot of hay with the COVID contracts, cronyism stuff. But as soon as they got into government, they had the sort of freebies accusation. I think it's hard to make these arguments about, I don't know, these sort of grifting arguments unless you're squeaky clean. And I think that's why it will be quite difficult, even though it will be interesting and useful for Labour to see these kind of messages working. It's hard to adopt them yourself. Just look at the planning bill. They're being accused of protecting developers who, donate money to the Labour Party, for example.
And also when you've got 400 plus MPs, the chances of one or two of them having something not even dodgy, but slightly questionable in their expenses or whatever is much, much higher.
Yeah.
Although it's fair to say that Reform are also having that problem with only 5 MPs, now down to 4, as of the last week.
And right, the messenger matters a lot. I mean, is Starmer a convincing kind of populist or a pugilist on these issues? Maybe not. And indeed, I guess you might have lots of people in the Treasury worrying that if you adopt this kind of rhetoric, it's going to put off investors and look anti-growth. So squaring it with all of these other different kind of moving pieces that the government has to think about is a challenge. And likewise on the Trump one, clearly they've decided to take quite a kind of conciliatory approach to Trump. So maybe it's hard for Labour to adopt these and in a way that's coherent with the rest of its kind of governing programme, or maybe there is a way through. But for sure, I think the research is clear that these are fairly clear patterns in the weaknesses of reform.